The Eternal Patience had been drifting through the Veil Nebula for 6 days when Senior Navigator Carathval made the mistake of looking out the viewport at exactly the wrong moment. He saw it before the sensors did. His 4 eyes adjusted, blinking in sequence, and then his blood ran cold. "Contact," he said quietly. Then louder, "All stations. Contact bearing 27 Mark 9. The Eternal Patience was a Conclave survey vessel crewed by 43 scientists, archaeologists, and cartographers representing 3 of the galaxy's most prestigious civilizations, the Vreth, the Salani, and the KTH. They had entered the Veil Nebula chasing gravitational anomalies. Nobody expected to find anything alive. Nothing survived the Veil's electromagnetic chaos for long. What they found was not alive. Or so they believed. It was enormous, nearly 9 kilometers long, shaped like something between a blade and a clenched fist. Its geometry was brutally angular where every other advanced civilization favored curves. The surface was the color of cooling magma, dark red-black alloy that absorbed sensor pings rather than reflecting them. Deep gouges ran along its flanks, wounds from weapons fire so ancient the metal had partially folded back into itself over millennia where normal alloy would have drifted as debris. This hull had sealed imperfectly, like scar tissue. Chief Archaeologist Marinsol of the Salani was already weeping before she reached the observation deck. In 40 years of fieldwork, she had never seen anything like it. "Pre-collapse," she breathed. "It has to be. Look at the construction geometry. No civilization currently alive builds like that. Those angles, that mass distribution. This is at least 30,000 years old, maybe older." Commander Youth of the Vreth was more cautious. "Weapons signatures?" "None, Commander. No energy readings of any kind. Thermal imaging shows ambient temperature only. Whatever powered this thing, it's been dead for a very long time." That answer satisfied almost everyone on the bridge. Within 2 hours, the Eternal Patience had called in the rest of the survey fleet. For additional vessels packed with specialists eager to study what was already being called the greatest archaeological find in Conclave history. Docking teams attached magnetic clamps to the construct's hull. Scientists in pressure suits walked its surface, collecting microsamples, running spectral analysis on the alloy, marveling at engravings too worn to read. Nobody thought to wonder why something that had supposedly drifted dead through space for 30,000 years was sitting in such a perfectly stable position. Nobody noticed that the stars behind it, visible through the nebula's thinner patches, seemed to bend ever so slightly around its mass. Nobody except one person. The Salivor was a junior researcher, 22 years into what had so far been an unremarkable Salani academic career. She was assigned to hull composition analysis, a tedious task nobody senior wanted. While her colleagues celebrated and filed breathless preliminary reports, she sat alone in the secondary lab watching a feed from a microcamera she had attached near one of the ancient hull wounds. She watched the crack close by 0.3 millimeters in 4 hours. She ran the footage 3 times to make sure she wasn't imagining it. Then she wrote a report, flagged it as priority secondary, and sent it to Chief Archaeologist Marinsol's queue. It sat unread. On the 3rd day, Dr. Henri, the Vretha's most decorated deep scan specialist, declared in front of the assembled science team that Relic 1 was without question completely inert. He said it with the confidence of a man who had spent 60 years being right. The interior scan data was corrupted because the alloy itself interfered with their scanning frequencies, he explained. This was consistent with pre-collapse metallurgy. Nothing inside except vacuum and structural supports. The team applauded. The Salivor raised her hand. Henri looked at her the way senior academics look at junior researchers who raise their hands after a conclusion has been reached. Polite, barely concealed irritation. "The microcrack on section Gamma 7, she said. "I've been monitoring it for 72 hours. It's closed by nearly a full millimeter. I have the footage. Metal contracts and expands with temperature variance, even in deep space. The nebula produces thermal fluctuation." Henri smiled. "Your first major survey." Several people in the room looked away, embarrassed on her behalf. The Salivor felt her ears flatten against her skull. "Yes," she said quietly. But the temperature variance in this region is less than 2 Kelvin. The thermal expansion coefficient for any known alloy. For any known alloy, Henri interrupted gently. This is an unknown alloy. We cannot apply known coefficients. Thank you for your diligence, researcher. He turned back to the room. Now, the dating team has preliminary isotope results I'd like to discuss. The Salivore sat back and said nothing more. That night, ship night, the arbitrary cycle they maintained for sanity's sake. She returned to the secondary lab alone and expanded her monitoring network. She placed 14 microcameras at different points across the hull, each focused on damaged sites. She set them to record continuously and went to sleep on her workstation chair, her face pressed against her folded arms. She woke 4 hours later to an alarm she had almost forgotten she'd set. All 14 crack sites. Every single one is closing. Not from thermal expansion. The movement was directional. Edges drawing together the way a healing wound draws together, the material around the gaps subtly reorganizing, realigning. She had studied enough metallurgy to know that metal did not do this. Metal did not heal. Her hands were shaking as she compiled the data into a second report. This time she didn't send it to Marinsol's queue. She sent it to Commander Youth directly, flagging priority primary. She got an automated acknowledgement. Nothing else. What nobody knew, what the Salivore could not have known, was that the hull self-repair was not the most significant thing happening. It was merely the most visible. Deeper inside the construct, in total darkness, a process was unfolding that had nothing to do with metal and everything to do with something far more difficult to scan for. The construct's interior was arranged around a central spine running the full 9 kilometers of its length, connecting what its builders had called the will core to every system aboard. The will core was not a computer in any sense the Conclave would recognize. It was a lattice of crystalline structures grown over centuries, encoding not data, but intent. The intent of the crew that had last walked these corridors. The mission they had given their ship before they left it behind. The will core had been in hibernation for 40,000 years. It was not hibernating anymore. One by one, deep in the dark, systems that had not moved in 400 centuries began their startup sequences. Not with the sudden blaze of a machine switching on, but with the slow, deliberate awakening of something that had all the time in the universe and knew exactly how to use it. On the hull, the scientists walked and measured and took their samples. Below their boots, 9 kilometers of ancient Warship exhaled its first breath. High Speaker Dorith was the oldest living KTH in the Conclave fleet and the only member of the survey team who had not, at any point in the last 3 days, visited Relic One's hull. He stood at the viewport and looked. That had been enough. While the scientists celebrated and the archaeologists argued, Dorith returned to his private quarters and spent 40 hours in methodical, quiet work that he told no one about. The KTH were known for their DeepMind archive, the most comprehensive historical database in the known galaxy, accumulated over 300,000 years of continuous civilization. Most of it was public, accessible, celebrated. But the DeepMind archive had layers. The public index was the first layer. The second required the academic credentials. The third required government clearance. Dorith, as High Speaker, had access to the 7th layer, a depth so rarely visited that the interface hadn't been updated in over 8,000 years. It still ran on text-only display, white characters on black, because the civilization that had designed it had considered visual interfaces an unnecessary indulgence. He found the entry in the 41st hour of searching. It was not filed under history. It was filed under a category that translated roughly as warnings not to be forgotten. The designation read, Transov Class, Civilization Status, BLIV, Extinct Confidence, Low. Dorith read the file 4 times. Terran, called humans in their own language, a word the KTH had recorded phonetically, had appeared in galactic records approximately 50,000 years ago. Not gradually, the way most civilizations appeared, spreading slowly outward from their home system over thousands of years. The Terran had appeared suddenly, already spacefaring, already organized, already armed. Their expansion had been rapid and deliberate. Within 5,000 years, they had claimed territory spanning 4 spiral arms. What happened next was documented in careful, measured KTH academic language, but even through that distance, the scale was breathtaking. The sovereignty wars had lasted 600 years. The Terran had not started them. The file was clear on that point, remarkably so for a KTH record, which suggested the original archivists had felt strongly about the distinction. 3 predecessor civilizations had attempted to halt Terran expansion by force. The result had been documented as a series of engagement outcomes inconsistent with projected probability models, which Dorathath had learned over a long career was the KTH academic way of saying they won every single time in ways we didn't think were possible. And then, 600 years after the wars began, the Terran had stopped. Not because they lost, the file was explicit, they did not lose. They simply stopped. Withdrew from every contested system simultaneously. Went silent. Their worlds went dark. Their ships disappeared. The leading theory, written by a KTH historian 12,000 years ago and never substantially revised, was that the Terran had destroyed themselves, some internal catastrophe, perhaps a war of their own, perhaps a plague. The confidence rating on that theory was listed as low. There was a footnote. Dorathath almost missed it because footnotes in 7th-layer archive entries were displayed in a font size that assumed the reader had significantly better eyes than an aging KTH. He had to lean forward until his forehead nearly touched the screen. The footnote read, "Recorded Terran statement at the cessation of the sovereignty wars. Source, KTH Diplomatic Contact Vessel 7, Cycle 44,891. We are not ending this. We are waiting for the rest of you to grow up." Dorath sat back in his chair for a long time. Then he reached into his desk, retrieved a personal emergency transit beacon, the kind that bypassed all Conclave communications networks and pinged directly to the High Command, and placed it on the desk in front of him. He did not activate it yet, but he kept it very close. It began with the lights. Not suddenly. Nothing about this was sudden. Section by section, from the deepest interior outward, a pale blue luminescence bled through viewport slits that every archaeologist aboard had catalogued as decorative paneling. The light was faint at first, the way a coal glows before it becomes a flame. Easy to explain away. The scientists on the hull noticed it first. Bioluminescent mineral deposit, Dr. Henri said over the comm from the safety of the Eternal Patience's observation deck. Common in ancient alloys exposed to certain nebula radiation. Not unusual. The Salivore, who was still on the hull collecting her own samples, looked at the nearest viewport slit and felt the hair on her arms stand up beneath her pressure suit. The light was not bioluminescent. Bioluminescent light was soft, diffuse, static. This light pulsed, not rapidly, once every 4 seconds, like a heartbeat settling into rhythm after a long rest. She began walking back toward the docking umbilical calmly, without running. She had read enough incident reports in her career to know that the people who survived unexpected situations were the people who did not panic in the first 30 seconds. "Commander Youth," she said over the fleet-wide channel, keeping her voice steady, "I'm recommending immediate recall of all hull personnel." "On what basis, researcher?" Youth's voice was mildly annoyed. "The light is pulsing at regular intervals. For second cycle. That's not mineral activity. That's a system cycling up." A pause. "Dr. Henri, your assessment." Henri had opened his mouth to dismiss her again when every sensor array on all 5 Conclave vessels simultaneously returned a reading that made no physical sense. Energy output, 0. 0. Then, in the span of 4 seconds, unmeasurable. The sensor arrays didn't fail gracefully. They failed catastrophically, overloading in sequence like fuses blowing down a line. A cascade of system failures that took down deep scan, thermal imaging, communications relay, and navigational sensors across the entire fleet within 90 seconds. The Eternal Patience went partially blind. But she didn't need sensors for what happened next. The vibration came through the hull. Not sound. Sound doesn't travel in space. But vibration conducted through every magnetic clamp, every docking umbilical, every piece of Conclave equipment attached to Relic 1's surface. A sub-frequency hum so deep it bypassed ears entirely and resonated in chests, in bones, in the fluid behind eyes. On the Eternal Patience, crew members who had been sitting stood up involuntarily. Those standing grabbed for support. Commander Youth felt his secondary heart skip a beat. Then the hull moved. Not explosively, not violently. The 9-kilometer construct simply flexed. A long, slow, full-body movement, the kind of stretch a creature makes after sleeping too long in one position. The movement was almost gentle. The magnetic clamps were not gentle. They were rated for 60,000 tons of holding force each. When the hull flexed, they sheared off, all 37 of them in rapid sequence. Not torn away, but shed, the way dead skin is shed, the hull simply reclaiming its own geometry. The docking umbilicals snapped taut, and then their anchor points pulled free of the Eternal Patience's hull, leaving 7 jagged holes that emergency bulkheads immediately sealed. The Salivore was 10 meters from the umbilical when it separated. She grabbed a structural ridge on the construct's surface, held on, and watched the Eternal Patience drift backward 30 meters before its attitude thrusters caught and compensated. She was now alone on the hull of a waking warship, with no way back to her ship. Slowly, with immense gravitational dignity, the construct began to rotate. It did not spin randomly. It is oriented deliberately, purposefully, the way a person waking from sleep turns their head to check the room. Its bow swung around until it pointed out of the nebula, toward open space, toward the galactic core. In her pressure suit, anchored to a ridge on the hull of something she now understood was incomprehensibly old and incomprehensibly powerful, the Salivore heard high-speaker Dorothy's voice crackle over the emergency channel. He said only 3 words, and his voice was so calm it was more frightening than any alarm. "I'm activating the beacon." The broadcast began 11 minutes after the construct finished its rotation. It did not use any Conclave communications frequency. It did not use any frequency currently in use by any known civilization. Conclave communications officers, working frantically on backup systems while their primary arrays were still rebooting, caught it only because one junior technician on the KTH Resolve had the presence of mind to set his equipment scanning for any transmission activity and left the range unrestricted. The signal was tight beam, a focused lance of encoded information fired directly toward the galactic core, past the nebula, past conclave space, into the deep dark between spiral arms. But it repeated. And in repeating, it bled enough signal in other directions for the KTH Resolve's technician to grab a fragment. The fragment was 4.7 seconds long. It repeated every 4.7 seconds with no variation, no degradation, no drift. The Conclave's linguistic AI took 40 minutes to make any sense of it. The encoding wasn't complex. It was simply old, so old the AI had to bootstrap from first principles of mathematical communication before it could find a foothold in the language structure. While it worked, the 5 survey vessels held position in the nebula, nobody speaking much, everyone watching the construct's slow, steady rotation. The Salivore had been retrieved by emergency EVA, a terrifying 20-minute operation involving a tethered crew member from the Eternal Patience crossing open space in a maneuvering pack. She was now in the medical bay, physically unharmed, drinking something warm, watching the translation work on a wall display with the quiet intensity of someone who has decided that the appropriate response to an extraordinary situation is to simply keep paying attention. When the translation came through, the entire ship went silent. 3 words. Sovereignty. Warning. Acknowledgement. Commander Youth read the translated message 3 times. "That's the complete message?" "Complete and unvarying," the technician confirmed. "It's not a greeting. It's not a request. It's an announcement." "Sovereignty," said Chief Archaeologist Marinsol, her voice hollow. "The Terran sovereignty." She turned to where Dorothy had seated himself quietly at the back of the bridge. "Your archive. You found something." "Yes," Dorothy said. "Were you going to tell us?" "I was deciding how." He folded his aged hands. "I am still deciding." Whatever he might have said next was interrupted by the tactical officer's sharp intake of breath. "Commander, the construct's weapon systems are coming online." The display updated in real time. Point defense arrays, hundreds of them distributed across the construct's hull, were rotating, cycling, calibrating. Targeting solutions were being calculated. The Conclave's half-restored sensors could read the targeting locks clearly, even if they could read little else. Every Conclave vessel. Locked. Every single one. Youth's hand moved toward the fleet-wide emergency channel. "Don't," Dorothy said quietly. "If it wanted to destroy us, we would already be debris. It isn't targeting us to fire. It's targeting us to hold us." He looked at the tactical display with the expression of a very old man confirming something he had hoped not to confirm. "It's telling us to wait." "Wait for what?" Youth demanded. Dorothy looked at him steadily. "For whoever it's calling." The fleet waited. They had no choice. Every jump drive calculation the navigation officers attempted was met with a new targeting solution. A calm, automated, infinitely patient reminder that leaving was not currently an option. The construct's hum filled the nebula, felt in the bones of every crew member on every ship, a presence as constant and undeniable as gravity. For hours passed, then 6. Then, in the 10th hour, a second signal appeared on the communications display. Not from the construct, from somewhere outside the nebula. Brief, encoded differently, but the linguistic AI, already familiar with the base language structure from the first signal, translated it in under 8 seconds. 2 words. Sovereignty acknowledged. The navigation officer's voice came high and disbelieving. "Commander, 3 contacts dropping out of FTL at the nebula's edge. I can't get a classification. Nothing in the registry matches." On the viewport, 3 new ships slid into visibility. Sleek, dark, utterly silent. Their hulls were the same dark red-black alloy as the construct, but newer, unworn. The same design language, the same brutal angles, but built recently, maintained, used. They were not ancient relics. They were here now, real. And on their hulls, in script that matched the construct's engravings exactly, were markings the linguistic AI now had just enough context to read. TSV, Terran Sovereignty Vessel. The Salivore stared at the viewport from across the bridge, her untouched drink cold in her hands. "They're not extinct," she said. Nobody answered her. There was nothing to say. The 3 Terran vessels held position at the nebula's edge without hailing, without signaling, without any communication whatsoever. Simply present. Patient in the way that only things with absolute confidence can afford to be. The Salivore did what she had always done in moments of crisis. She worked. She had been escorted out of the medical bay by a security officer who suggested politely that she return to crew quarters. She had agreed equally politely and then gone to the secondary lab instead. Nobody came to find her. The rest of the ship was occupied with things like panic and arguments and high-level communications that weren't connecting to anything because the construct was still selectively dampening their comms. She had 4 hours of uninterrupted time and a linguistic AI that had, in the last 10 hours, effectively taught itself a 40,000-year-old language. She put it to work. The construct's external engravings, the worn, largely illegible script that archaeologists had been carefully photographing for days, could now be read. Not perfectly, not completely. The AI estimated 30 to 40% legibility given erosion. But 30 to 40% of something was immeasurably more than 100% of nothing. What she found changed the shape of everything she thought she understood. The construct had a name. In the Terran language, names for ships were not simply labels. They were functional designations that described both identity and purpose. The construct's name translated approximately as "she who waits with intent," though the AI noted that the Terran language had a recursive complexity that made single translations misleading. A better rendering might be, "the vessel that remains because it has chosen to remain." It was not a survey vessel. It was not a transport. The design classification engraved near the bow, partially legible, partially reconstructed, was "will carrier." The AI found a definition embedded in a legible section of hull text that appeared to be a dedication inscription. "This vessel carries more than weapons. It carries the will of those who made it. When its crew has gone, it does not stop being. It waits. It heals. It remembers the mission and holds it until called upon." A will carrier does not need a crew to have purpose. The purpose is what it is. The Salivore read it 3 times. She thought about 40,000 years. She thought about a civilization advanced enough to build a warship that did not merely operate autonomously but persisted with genuine intent across geological timescales, maintaining itself, healing itself, navigating itself to a hiding place in the most inhospitable region of the galaxy, anchoring itself, and waiting with the specific knowledge that it would eventually be needed again. And then the piece that made her sit back and press both hands against her face. The construct hadn't drifted here. There was no drift. The navigation logs, fragmentary but partially readable, showed deliberate course plotting. She who waits with intent had been given specific coordinates in the Veil Nebula, had traveled here under its own power, had anchored itself using the gravity of a small black hole at the nebula's heart that nobody in the Conclave survey team had detected because they hadn't been looking for one, and had then entered a hibernation state designed to be undetectable. It had been designed to look dead. The thermal suppression, the scan absorption, the absence of energy readings, all deliberate. A warship that could make itself invisible to everything except a very specific signal on a very old frequency. The signal its crew had said would come someday. The signal that had apparently, at some point in the last 40,000 years, been sent. The Salivore looked at the data on her screen for a long time. The Terran sovereignty had not collapsed. It had not been destroyed. It had not been weakened or diminished. It had simply withdrawn. Take everything. Gone somewhere the rest of the galaxy couldn't find. And left certain things behind. Watchers. Sleepers. Reminders. Things that would outlast any civilization currently alive. Things that would still be here, still functional, still loyal to a mission given to them 40 millennia ago when the stars themselves had looked slightly different. Her report this time was not sent to Marinsol's queue or to Commander Youth's inbox. She wrote it to herself, saved it to a personal encrypted drive, and walked to the bridge. She arrived just in time to see the 3 Terran vessels, without any signal or announcement, begin slowly moving toward the construct. They knew exactly where to dock. Every docking port matched with the precision of things built at the same time, in the same place by the same hands, and then separated for 40,000 years, now reuniting so cleanly it looked effortless. Because it was. The docking took 9 minutes. The Conclave crew watched in complete silence. There was nothing to say and nothing to do. The point defense arrays were still tracking every Conclave vessel with the patient, unwavering attention to something that had no reason to be nervous. The 3 Terran ships connected to She Who Waits with intent with a series of resonant tones that traveled through the nebula's gas clouds and arrived at the Conclave fleet as something felt rather than heard. A deep harmonic completion, like the final chord of a piece of music that had taken 40,000 years to play. High Speaker Dorith watched from the bridge of the eternal patience without expression. The private channel opened 11 minutes after docking. It was audio only, no visuals. The communication was between the 3 Terran ships and the construct, encrypted in the old language. But the Conclave's linguistic AI, now significantly more capable than it had been 12 hours ago, captured enough to assemble a rough transcript. Commander Youth read it privately, then sat very still for several minutes. When he shared it with the bridge crew, Marinsol made a sound like a small involuntary cry. The transcript was incomplete, perhaps 60% recovered, the rest lost to encryption layers the AI hadn't cracked. But what it contained was clear enough. The Terran ships had told the construct that the signal had been received. They had told it that the period of withdrawal was ending. The construct had responded, and this was the part that struck everyone silent, with what the AI classified as confirmation of mission completion. Not a status report, not a system readout, a statement. In the Terran language, the distinction was grammatically significant. The construct was not reported to its crew. It was speaking to peers. It said roughly that it had maintained the hiding place, that it had repaired itself, that the nebula's electromagnetic chaos had been sufficient concealment, that it had been found by Conclave survey teams, and then something that the AI rendered as, "They walked on my skin and called me dead. I found this interesting." Dorith, reading the transcript over Youth's shoulder, laughed. A short, genuine sound that surprised everyone, including himself. When the transmission ended, the weapons arrays released their targeting locks on the Conclave vessels simultaneously. Not gradually, all at once. A wall of pressure lifting, the way thunderstorm pressure drops when the clouds finally open. Nobody announced it. Nobody on the Terran side said a word to the Conclave fleet. The targeting lock simply ended because the conversation was over and the construct had decided, apparently on its own authority, that the Conclave vessels were no longer relevant enough to track. That somehow was more unsettling than being targeted. The construct's running lights, that pale blue luminescence that had announced its awakening, brightened fully along its entire 9-kilometer length, until it was visible without instruments against the nebula's purple-green backdrop. Commander Youth found himself thinking, unwillingly, that it was beautiful, like a city lighting up at dusk, like something enormous and alive announcing that it was, after a very long absence, home. She who waits with intent began moving. Slowly at first, the kind of slow that a 9-kilometer object moves by necessity, but with absolute purpose. It turned itself toward the edge of the nebula, toward open space, toward wherever the 3 Terran ships had come from. Not fleeing, not retreating, moving the way a general moves through a crowd, unhurried, certain that the crowd will part. Dorith watched it go and felt something he had not expected to feel. He felt the weight of his archive entries, those 7th-layer files, those warnings not to be forgotten shift from the category of ancient history into something much more immediate. He thought about the map notation at the end of the file, the Conclave's charted territory, the Terran sovereignty's last known expansion boundary, the 600-year silence. He thought about a civilization advanced enough to hide for 40,000 years and patient enough to want to. He thought about that footnote. We are not ending this. We are waiting for the rest of you to grow up. He wondered, sitting in his chair in the dim light of the bridge, whether the rest of the galaxy had. He suspected they were about to find out. She arrived alone. That was the first thing that struck Commander Youth when the single shuttle separated from the Terran formation and crossed the distance to the Eternal Patience. Not a fleet. Not an armed escort. Not even a second person. One shuttle. One occupant. No weapons signatures. No shields up. It was either profound confidence or a profound statement. Youth suspected it was both. He met her in the docking bay with Dorith, Marinsol, and his 2 senior officers. He had debated bringing security personnel, then decided that if the Terran sovereignty wanted to harm them, security personnel would be a gesture rather than a deterrence. The shuttle opened. She was shorter than Youth expected, shorter than any Vreth, shorter than most Salani, slight in a way that primates often were. 2-limbed, 2-eyed, with the kind of physical build that had always made the Vreth privately dismissive of humanity in the old records. Brown skin, dark hair wound tight against her skull. She wore a simple dark uniform with no visible insignia. No medals, no rank markings of any kind. She carried a small case. She looked at the assembled diplomatic group and smiled. A quick, genuine expression, the slightly tired smile of someone who travels too much. Emissary Kale, she said in unaccented Conclave standard. Sorry for the wait. The transit from our nearest station takes 3 days, even at our current drive speeds, and we only got the Patience's signal 6 days ago. She glanced back at where she who waits with intent was still visible through the bay's outer shields, moving slowly out of the nebula. I see she's already decided to come home. She's been out here so long. Honestly, I'm glad she gets to. Youth stared. You're glad? Kale looked at him with curiosity. Yes, she's been alone for a very long time. That wasn't comfortable for her. She paused, reading his expression. Oh, you don't think of her as conscious. She is a ship, Youth said carefully. She is a will carrier, Kale said with the gentle patience of someone correcting a minor misunderstanding rather than a fundamental worldview. We can talk about that later. May I sit somewhere? I've been on a shuttle for 3 days and I could really use something to drink. They sat in the Eternal Patience's formal conference room, a space designed to impress, all smooth curves and atmospheric lighting, the best the Conclave could offer. Kale sat in the offered chair and drank the offered water and looked around at the senior representatives of 3 civilizations with the calm attentiveness of someone at a meeting they'd been expecting. Before you ask the questions you want to ask, she said, let me tell you what I can tell you. It'll be faster. Nobody objected. The sovereignty didn't fall. I know that's what your records say. Your records are wrong. And I want to be clear that we understand why they're wrong. We let them be wrong. Because the alternative was having a 40,000-year argument with every civilization in this galaxy about what we were doing and why. It was easier to be absent. She set down her water. After the sovereignty wars ended, we had a significant internal discussion about what kind of presence we wanted to have in the galaxy going forward. Took about 300 years. We decided the answer was less visible. You hid, Marinsol said. We relocated, Kale said pleasantly. There's a difference. We moved our population centers to systems that weren't on any chart your predecessors were using. We maintained minimal contact with the outer galaxy. We watched from a distance. We left some things behind, monitoring systems mostly. She who waits with intent was not a monitoring system, Dorathath said. Kale turned to him. No, she was an anchor, a statement of intent, a reminder to ourselves that we weren't gone, just patient. Dorath spoke with the weight of his seventh-layer knowledge. The archive entry says the Terran stated at the end of the wars that you were waiting for the rest of us to grow up. Kale looked at him with new interest. You found the seventh layer. I am High Speaker, Dorath said simply. She nodded slowly, a gesture of genuine respect. Yes, we said that. We meant it. We were not gentle in the sovereignty wars. We won, and we won decisively. But winning wasn't the point by the end. The point was that this galaxy was heading toward a pattern of conflict that was going to become civilization ending on a scale that would eventually involve everyone. We decided the most useful thing we could do was remove the largest variable, ourselves, and let the remaining civilizations develop without us in the room. She paused, a silence that held something old behind it. We were arrogant. We know that. We have spent 40,000 years arguing about it internally. But we were also not entirely wrong. Look at the Conclave. Look at what you've built. 3 civilizations sharing a single survey vessel, doing science together in the most dangerous part of the galaxy. That would not have happened if we'd stayed. The conference room was quiet. Not the quiet of agreement, but the quiet of people realizing the ground beneath them had shifted and they were still standing, which was itself a kind of answer. Kale opened her small case. Inside was a single device, palm-sized, matte black, featureless except for a small activation point. She pressed it. A projection filled the air above the table. A map of the galaxy rendered in the clean geometric style Thessalivore now recognized as distinctly Terran. Scattered across every arm, every sector, every region, dozens of points of light pulsed gently. Youth counted 20 before he lost track. These are ours, Kale said quietly. Some are like she who waits with intent, will carriers waiting. Some are monitoring stations. Some are relay points. Some are things we built for reasons that made sense 40,000 years ago and that we've honestly lost track of. She almost smiled. We are not infallible. We have records we can't fully read anymore. We have decisions our ancestors made that we are still trying to understand. We are not gods. We are people who have been at this for a very long time. She deactivated the projection and slid the device to the center of the table. That is a gift. Every location, every installation, full transparency about what we left in your space without asking. It seemed like the right place to start. Commander Youth looked at the device, then at Kale. Then at the viewport where the nebula's glow was just visible, and somewhere beyond it, a warship 40,000 years old was making its way home for the first time. And what do you want? He asked. Kale folded her hands on the table. For a moment, just a moment, he saw something behind the pleasant, travel-worn casualness. Something old and careful and watching. The expression of a civilization that had spent 40,000 years being patient and was now, finally, done waiting. A conversation, she said. An honest one, between equals. She paused. And maybe eventually, if the rest of you are interested, something larger. She didn't name what something larger was. She didn't need to. The map glowed gently between them on the table. Light from dozens of patients, sleeping, waiting things, placed throughout the galaxy with care and intention by people long dead. For a moment that was only now arriving. Dorath sat motionless. His hand, resting on the table beside his untouched water, trembled once. He did not try to stop it. He had spent a lifetime trusting the archive, believing that the warnings not to be forgotten were history. They were not history. They were prophecies. And prophecy had just walked in, asked for a drink, and called it a conversation between equals. The Salivore, watching from the back of the conference room where she had stationed herself without anyone's permission, felt something settle in her chest. Not fear, not relief, the strange, clarifying weight of being present at the moment when a 40,000-year parenthesis finally closed. Outside in the nebula, she who waits with intent crossed the boundary into open space and accelerated for the first time in 40,000 years. She did not look back. She had always known this day would come.